guys, so it is President's Day, or at least it is on the day that I am putting this video up, and given the current state of everything this particular President's Day, I wanted to do some nonfiction content specifically focused on reading to understand or have some action items, or just like trying to turn some of that inside your head into either understanding or an actionable item. And that's what I've decided to do. I have made this giant list of books. I've put them in 4 categories, and I want to say up front that I don't think that these categories are exhaustive. I don't think that there aren't maybe some better books out there on some of this stuff. I read nonfiction as fast as I possibly can. This is just going to be some of my personal favorite books that I really want to share with you guys. So I have some books that I have titled Helpful History, which might involve some contextualizing history for, you know, how we get here or how certain things work, and books that really helped me to understand things better than I did before, both on a historical level and also on a political level. I have a specific category for books that better helped me understand the current political divide, which, if you listen to the mainstream media, sometimes feels like it's like something new that's happened since, you know, in the last 10 years or so, but like this is an ongoing thing. I struggled to find just 4 books to put in this category, but I've tried to give you 4 of the best that again have really helped me. I then have 4 books that I've labeled action items. If you're looking for books that have some sort of like actionable thing at the end, or something that they leave you with that we can all go out and do, or maybe not do by ourselves, but potentially, you know, get in community and do, rather than just a history book. And then to wrap it all up, I have just 2 books that I want to share with you guys that I'm calling comfort reads, which are history books, but are not the type that makes you scream, but the type that may provide some comfort in these times. So to start out with, in my helpful history category, we have The Hardest Job in the World, The American Presidency by John Dickerson. Now, I've talked about this in multiple other nonfiction episodes because I really like this book. In regards to this video today, this is a history book that spans the length of the American presidency, not focusing necessarily on the presidents themselves, but how they were shaped by their time, and indeed sometimes how they were elected by their time. We talk sometimes about how like, oh, this person like couldn't have gotten elected here, or like we're confused how this person ever got elected, because their times were just so different. And in particular, the evolving nature of what we as Americans expect from the president. We expect very different things, even under normal circumstances, from the president than they did, say, in Washington's time. So I think Dickerson has put together a really good timeline of how and why those shifts have happened. Not necessarily saying that we should go backwards, right? But just kind of explaining why the people that we elect are different and what we expect from them are different based on how the history of America has kind of moved forward. Just as an example, think about the president going to the place of a natural disaster. That is an extremely, in the history of America, recent development that really was not expected of presidents for most of the presidency. So just things like that we've changed over the course of American existence. This book has really helped me put not only the presidents, but the presidency in perspective of a longer, like, you know, length of time. The next book that I want to talk about is called Kill Switch: The Rise of the Modern Senate and the Crippling of American Democracy by Adam Gentleson. This is a book that I read because I will admit that despite the basics of, like, you know, your high school government class, when I started this history challenge and reading all these nonfiction books, one of the reasons was that I really didn't understand how the Senate worked, how the House worked, how then Congress like worked together. It genuinely wasn't something that I really understood. And so when all this stuff, particularly during the Obama presidency, starts coming up about how, you know, the Senate is just making all this stuff like not happen. I was like, well, how can they do that? And how is that different? And what Gentleson has done in this book is, again, put the current, at the time, workings of the Senate. This book was published what feels like a lifetime ago now, but a number of years ago. So really putting like the Obama presidency specifically in the crosshairs here, putting the actions of the Senate then in conversation with how the Senate as a body has evolved or not since it was created. And so if you are someone who wants to better understand that particular body and its actions, this is a really helpful book for that. Really now taking like a broad look at American history, I really enjoyed Fantasyland: How America Went Haywire, A 500-Year History by Kurt Anderson. This is a book that I read even prior to COVID and all of the vaccine stuff that was happening, and all of our differences of opinions about it. It just seemed like everything. And this genuinely is a 500-year history of America. So Anderson goes back even before America was America and kind of talks about how the seeds of what he calls the American fantasy industrial complex, so a play on Dwight D. Eisenhower there, has been in the bones and the genes and the foundation of people from the second that they came over from England or Europe, and what they wanted what eventually becomes America to be, how that, was that sense of like imagination and fantasy is kind of what allowed the founders to imagine that they could actually break free of Britain, which at the time was a completely like astronomically high bar to clear, but also how it's happened, we've used it to our detriment to kind of think that we are allowed to create our own fantasy worlds and live in them. And it touches, like I said, everything from the founders, the Puritans, to like Disney. So it really is a wide-ranging history book and sociocultural book that just made a lot of things make more sense to me about certain, what feels like specifically American ways of thinking and dreaming about the world, for good and for bad. Now for a book that I think bridges my helpful history category and my political divine category, but I've labeled it under helpful history here, is American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America by Colin Woodard. I've read basically everything Colin Woodard has written, and I've really enjoyed it, but I think for me, the most important of his works for this project is American Nations. Because you read that right. It says the 11 rival regional cultures of North America. Because sometimes we talk about like regional, sectional divides in America. It's like north, south, east, west. And it also kind of like stops at the boundary lines of the countries. And Woodard's book really takes us back to how different regions, not just like, this part of America versus this part of Canada, even though they touch, right? But how different regions, who they were developed by, how they developed, their foundations, because again, remember, not all of America is founded or at the same time, right? It really starts in New England and then goes out, and Native Americans here, but the Native Americans as well were different types of nations. And so all of these differences, these regional differences, come into making different parts of North America these, like what he has labeled 11 different regions. It's a really, really interesting way to conceptualize differences across, how we're like, oh, well, this state is technically north and this state is technically south, but like they're very similar, but like these two states that are next to them aren't. Makes a lot more sense, honestly, when you look at his map and understand his reasoning, to really, really think about how the flows of history have way more impact than just lines on a map. It's really, really interesting reading. So Woodard's book could definitely be either helpful history or political divide. It definitely is more of like a history book, which is why I left it where it is. But in terms of books about helping to understand political divide, and the thing is that when we say political divide, I feel like normally people are thinking Republican or Democrat, but like there are so many different things that divide people in America. And I've tried to cover either like some distinct things and then some more global books. But I definitely absolutely want to start by recommending Caste, The Origin of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. This goes back to the very language of enslavement and putting American enslavement and then the Jim Crow system in conversation with the caste system both in India and also Nazi Germany. So it's not only American history, but I feel like this global conversation is necessary to make her point, because words like race that we use here in America, they have a historical context, they have a social context, a cultural context, and she is able to explain how that is embedded in our very language and therefore our history in this book, and then kind of show that more like global context. It's really, really good. I know that it gets recommended all the time, but there's a reason for that. It's really, really worth reading. I hesitated to put this book on the list because it is really dense, but if you are more of like a history person who's okay with that, Freedom's Dominion, A Saga of White Resistance to Federal Power by Jefferson Cowie won the awards that it's won for a reason. It definitely is dense, but it uses the focal place of this place in Alabama that is actually the eventual birthplace of George Wallace, and kind of uses that as a focal town, city, population to follow from like when America begins all the way through like then the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, and how people in Alabama and around this town specifically organized white resistance to the changing laws and like social, legal, cultural mores of the time. I definitely went into it not really knowing that that was like going to have a focal town. I thought it was going to be more high level. But by really focusing it on this one place, this one set of like geographical confines and the people who like are raised and live there and the generations that go by, it's really, really interesting. Like I said, this is probably the densest book on the list, but it covers a lot of history, a lot of really interesting history that by personifying it in that way helps it to make more sense. Skipping forward in time, we have one of my favorite books of all time, Wild Land, The Making of America's Fury by Evan Osnos. This is a book that seeks to explain the change in America from what Evan Osnos calls this incredible moment of unity after around September 11th and around the terror attacks in 2001, and then using that as a marker for a 20-year period to 2021 where America seems more divided than ever, and really using like confining it to that time frame to try to understand through a series of different places where Osnos has lived throughout his life. You know, places as different as Greenwich, Connecticut, which is one of the richest zip codes in America, and then also he lived in Appalachia for a time. So it's a really personal book filled with an incredible amount of investigative journalism and talking to real people, which I think is really important. And he really went out there and got, you know, talked to some really, really big power players, but also just like people on the ground who were in that place for those entire 20 years and watched this shift happen. It's a really, really excellent book. It's also not as long as you might think, considering that it tries to do 4 places, 20 years, all that type of stuff. It's just a really compelling read, and I highly recommend it. Finally, for any people who want something with less of a historical bent and more of a psychology bent, I want to recommend Good Reasonable People, The Psychology Behind America's Dangerous Divide by Keith Payne. This is a book that I've read some other books about, like, you know, here's why we are divided and here's like all these things. And what I really appreciated about this book is it really took it down to just like genuine tested psychology rather than trying to make like claims that for me, I think this just like kind of shows you the nerd I am, right? Or just don't seem to be like grounded in any kind of credible, testable anything. And instead, Keith Payne has the ability to translate really complicated psychology experiments and this great work that has been done by academics to try to understand how we get here in a way that is very both like generous and critical of all of the sides of the divide, right? And talking about how we kind of sometimes get stuck on our side, whether that's red, blue, whatever, but also how we as individuals can kind of trick ourselves into assuming, well, we must be right or we must be on the right side of history, and maybe not take in as much information as we should because we want to believe that we are good, reasonable people and that this can happen to anyone. I just finished this in the last couple of months, and all of a sudden it just like, I was like, okay, this helps to make a lot of other stuff make sense. So I offer it to people who maybe want less history, more psychology, as a way to help wrap their minds around what to some people can just feel like complete illogic, when to other people it's a completely logical train of thought. So in my action item section, again, these are books that I feel like lay out some sort of like path forward in a number of different ways. But I want to start with one that maybe doesn't offer as much of a path as like a lot of yelling that we maybe should have been doing earlier. It's called Chaotic Neutral: How the Democrats Lost Their Soul in the Center by Ed Bermilla. There's been a number of books published in probably even just the last year, let alone the rest of forever, about what has happened to the Republican Party. I did a whole video on those, some of them. I can't read all of them, so you can go and check out. This was the only book that I really found about the Democrats during the same time and really pointing out the flaws in the Democratic Party strategy. And as I see more and more people on Blue Sky just like yelling about, you know, the Democratic Party, you know, Ed Bermilla wrote this a number of years ago at this point, and all of these criticisms are still very valid, and they kind of help us to understand how we got here. If you have other recommendations for books about the Democratic Party, I'd be really interested, because I think that that is a understudied subject. I think that, as this book makes clear, they are not exempt from criticism or close historical analysis to think about how the party has been shaped by its history. This one has a very provocative title for how I feel right now, so just hang here with me for a second. It's called After the Ivory Tower Falls: How College Broke the American Dream and Blew Up Our Politics and How to Fix It by Will Bunch. Now, obviously, I want to be an academic. I believe strongly in the power of academia, and it is currently very much under attack right now, so I'm not interested in necessarily the ivory tower falling, but I definitely think that that tower needs to be rebuilt in something closer to the ground. What I really, really liked, particularly about this book, is that it didn't just take a binary approach, like those who went to college and those who didn't, which in like polling and stuff is often how that is kind of portrayed, which is super annoying. Bunch really goes into detail on people who went to college, and there are some people for whom that went really well and that really worked out for them and it helped them be really successful. And then there's people who went to college and it wasn't for them and it didn't help them be successful and it put them in debt and all that type of stuff. And then there are people who didn't go to college and who are then locked out of certain parts of the workforce. This did not work out for them. They wanted to go to college. They couldn't for these reasons. It was really detrimental to their life. And then people who didn't go to college, and for them, that was the absolutely right path and they were successful in these ways and all that type of stuff. And also, like I said, diversifying that polling point that's like these people who went to college and these people who didn't go to college, and like complicating that in our thoughts about how like just thinking about populations like that doesn't really help us, because there are some people, you know, there are these multiple avenues that either not going or going to college can take you down. And as someone who's really interested in higher ed reform, I really appreciated his multifaceted look at this issue, how it affects our politics, and the different ways that we could move forward. Don't know if any of them are really in the cards right now, but again, this is one of the few multifaceted looks at this that I've really been able to read. Okay, before I talk about this next book, I want to preface it with the fact that this is the worst possible title they could have gone with for this book. I'm really upset about it, to be honest with you. So the title that they gave this book, unfortunately for all of us, is White Rural Rage: The Threat to American Democracy by Tom Schaller and Paul Waldman. Now, despite that rather aggressive title, this is actually more of a dry style book. These two people are academics who went into rural areas and did a lot of research, did a lot of interviews, and they have, you know, narrativized it for a book, but it's mostly them reporting their findings. And I will say that as someone who grew up in a 99.9% white rural town, I felt especially like, whoa, because the opening anecdote is in a county directly next to the one that I grew up in New York. Like, I know that town. I know the place and the people that they're talking about there. So I like made it like partway into the first chapter and I went, this is really close to home. The thing, especially with this title, the thing that really irritates me is that Waldman and Schaller are really trying to speak to people living in rural areas and talking to them about how they sometimes support politicians who then do not support them. And they get stuck in this loop. And yes, in particular, they are calling out Republican politicians a lot who, you know, try to gin up the rural vote through these like culture war politics, but then don't actually do anything to really support rural communities, because they're like actually focused on other things. But you get stuck in the cycle of supporting these people who are not supporting you. It's definitely primarily Republicans. This is not limited to Republicans though, as we've seen in some of the complaints against the Democratic Party right now. But the thing is, with that title, really, it just feels like an attack, I'm sure. And so I'm really aggravated that people who maybe could read this and take something away from it to really help support their local community that really needs politicians to pay attention to it. They need an influx of cash dollars. They need more economic development, like whatever it is. And then also talking about how, you know, these rural areas, which are painted as predominantly white, often do have, you know, people of color living there, and how to more like integrate communities better instead of like, because you all live there, you all live in that town, and these like culture war stuff isn't helping anybody. So it's really unfortunate. And so I think that the only way to really make use of this book is for people who are not going to immediately feel attacked by it to read it and then try to translate those things out, because yeah, I mean, I know people that I grew up with that I would love to give this to as like an organizing tool or like a thought tool at least, and they would never read it because of that title. So it's very upsetting to me. And I wish, it must have been for marketing, I guess, but like, guys, if you want things to actually do the work you want it to do, you can't give it that title. It doesn't even really make sense with the content. Okay, so the last book in my action item section is called The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared Future by Robert P. Jones. I don't want to go to extreme detail about this book because I talked about it at length in a social justice themed reading roundtable that we did on the channel, and so you may have already heard me talk about it. I really loved how this book, I didn't know that necessarily going into it, but I really loved how this book talked about how we can use history and the remembrance of history as a way to kind of bridge the divides left behind by white supremacy in very specific areas and their specific like racialized history. And they use very specific like examples and how literally people who are, you know, descended from, for example, white people who were involved in the violence against African Americans, and then descendants or relations of those African Americans come together to create historical sites, to create some type of remembrance, and how everyone navigates that to make sure that we don't forget about these things and that we also learn from them, because not forgetting and learning, two separate things. So finally, I just want to touch on two history books that I have read in the past year and left me feeling a little bit comforted, I guess, the only way that I can really talk about it, even though the things that they're describing are not always comforting. But anyway, the first one that I want to talk about is Prequel, An American Fight Against Fascism by Rachel Maddow. I have also listened to the podcast that is related to this book, and I highly recommend both of them. But what I really like about this is, even as someone who's read a lot of history about World War II, it really focuses here on the fascism developing in America before. I think that there's not a lot of conversation about how prior to the US entering the war, there was support in America for Hitler's government. And that didn't just necessarily go up in smoke even after America entered the war and then after the war ended. And certain things, you know, were still kind of being debated. And there was a lot of, in this book, just regular people standing up and saying absolutely not, even when at times the American government didn't want to touch this stuff with a 10-foot pole. And I really, really loved those stories, and the book is really compelling. I mean, the podcast as well. They both include some different information, so they're worth listening or reading both of them. But yes, the stories of individual people standing up are really helpful right now, I think. And this is a more like historical, very situated context that unfortunately has a lot of relevance to right now. And then finally, this is a book that I just finished and I wanted to make sure that I included in this video. It's The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It by Corey Brettschneider. This book starts out with talking about John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so I kind of thought, oh, okay, so it's going to be like the story about John Adams, and it's going to be a story about this president and the story about this president. And it is that in a way. But what Brettschneider focuses on is like the president during which there was this thing that happened that was really problematic for democracy, but then also focusing on the story afterwards in which citizens, and then yes, even a restorative presidency kind of fixes that problem. And normally these restorative presidency are generated and, you know, pushed by citizens who say this was wrong and now we need to fix it. And in the case of, for example, John Adams, you know, it talks about John Adams and then Thomas Jefferson and then James Madison, and that's kind of the restorative arc there about this specific thing. But there are longer arcs. So for example, you think about the president that came before Lincoln, and then how even Lincoln had to, like, he's not just the immediate restorative presidency, right? He has to be convinced by people like Frederick Douglass and his movement to move his own beliefs on, you know, African American equality and freedom. But this is still not the end, because after Lincoln, who has been moved, you get Andrew Johnson, who kind of sets everything back, and then you get Grant after that who has to pull it forward again. And so what I really appreciated is that even though it probably could have been something that was like these individual stories, like threads from even the Alien and Sedition Acts and John Adams appear at the end when we're talking about like Nixon, for example. And so rather than making it some individual like moments in time, this cycle of damage and restoration, and it's not all one direction, it goes like this, and it really is generated by regular citizens putting pressure on the government, and how they did that made this book a lot better than honestly I maybe thought it would have been, just based on like the title and how I understood it. I think knowing that it's a more cohesive story really, really helps and makes it like an exceptional book. This has been a really, really long video, so I'm very grateful if you've hung out here till the end. Like Michaela and I have been saying, we've been trying to do a lot of like uplift on the channel in terms of, you know, suggesting books and trying to make book lists and even anticipated reads, because there's a lot of stuff going on in the world right now and everything feels very unstable and rather negative. One of my ways of also dealing with that, like I said, is just knowledge acquisition. I am definitely a person who thinks that the more I know, the better informed I am, the better I can process and deal with things as they come up. And so this is one of my ways to share some books that I absolutely loved, and also I think have meaning for maybe some specific things that you want to learn about right now or know more about, or even if it is just those comfort reads that I added at the end to kind of understand the historical moment, and hopefully better understand what happens tomorrow, because there is a lot flying around right now and nothing happens in a vacuum. And that's why I love history, because when you understand history, it helps you to understand certain things that may seem to have come out of nowhere or like lack logic. And oftentimes what I realize is that I just lack context and contextual understanding of how this thing happened. And once I can get a better handle on that, things make more sense. And that's not always a good type of sense, right? It may still be something that I don't agree with, but as far as I'm concerned, knowledge is power. Those understandings help us go forward in dealing with them, handling them, understanding them. So if I can do nothing else today, I will learn a little more, I will understand a little more, and I will put that knowledge in my pocket as my power. If you have other recommendations of books you think I might like to read based on this list, or books for anyone who watches this, please put them down below in the comments. I am always ready, willing, and eager to start a new one. I do have a full list on my Goodreads. I have not reconstituted it on my Storygraph yet because it's really long. I've read over 230 books for this reading challenge. So there is that full list and my ratings and reviews on my Goodreads. And you can always go back into the American President's Reading Challenge playlist for thoughts on other books that I've read, both good, bad, and really bad. Thanks, guys. Bye.